Good afternoon, Your Holiness. Good afternoon, everyone out there in Temple Land. My name is Ari Eisen, and I'm one of the original founders of the Emory-Tibet Science Initiative and the leader of the biology group. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about life, what is life, the origins of life, and the origins of a life. Before we get to that, I just wanted to say that it's hard to imagine when we first started with your vision of the Emory-Tibet Science Initiative that it would become this. And it does my heart good. I think the participants here illustrate the beauty of your vision. For example, Geshe Nawang Norbu from Serije was at Emory for 3 years and has been studying biology and has become a leader of science at his monastery. But we knew that there'd be an exchange in science and Buddhism, but what we didn't appreciate is all the ripples of that exchange. For example, Geshe Nawang started a group at Emory of Chinese students and Tibetan students getting together to talk about things. Maybe one of the first times ever that's happened. To his left, we have Dr. Joel Zivit, who's an old friend of mine, who's a physician. So I invited him to come and teach here at Drepung a couple of summers ago. So we bring medicine and anesthesiologists and all his wisdom from the hospital into work with the monastics. We have Jompa Kechik from Serije, who spent 2 years at Emory, becoming a science scholar, and now will become a leader in science. And finally, also here around this table are some of the great scientists of our generation. And I include Dr. Scott Gilbert in that. He's a hero of mine, a developmental biologist, whose textbook I used when I was a student, and I used when I was a teacher. And many people around the world have used Scott's textbook in developmental biology. And Scott is here today to talk to us about the origin of a life. He is a professor emeritus from Swarthmore, as well as from the University of Helsinki. And he studies that magic problem of how does the turtle get its shell. And today he's and today he's going to talk to us about the origin of a life. Scott.
Thank you very much, Your Holiness, esteemed members of the audience. I am extremely privileged and honored to be here today. I wish to thank the scholars, the educators, the funders, the translators at ETSI for allowing this to be possible. We heard this morning many exciting new discoveries, and I'm sure that we'll hear tomorrow about many new exciting discoveries. Today, I will tell you absolutely nothing new. At the end of this talk, I expect that you will say, why did this person be invited? He told us nothing we didn't know already. That is my goal. Let's see. Oops. Okay. I study animal development, and I get to look at those processes that enable the amazing journey from egg to baby. Developmental biology studies those interactions that enable organisms to be made and their parts coordinated. It is a science about becoming, not a science of being. Okay.
디 로디 세션은 과하면도 그게 빠르도 설명. Yes, you carry.
Okay. Developmental biology is a science about becoming, not about being. What you see here is a photograph of a 2-day chick embryo. The embryo is in the center. The head is at the top, the brain is forming, the heart is slightly below the brain, and there are blood vessels going in and out of the heart. The heart is pumping fluid throughout the body, but most of the blood is going to get nutrients, food from the yolk. What's interesting is that the capillaries, those blood vessels are made before there is blood to go in them. We are seeing the construction of the organism and the beating of the heart before there is blood to circulate. That 2-day embryo, of course, is part of a much larger pattern of development, that there are stages in chick development here, and the chick hatches in 21 days. And developmental biologists looking at the parts of the embryo find that they are not produced by themselves. Rather, the parts of the embryo are created by the interactions with other parts that are also in the process of becoming. The body forms in numerous processes of codependent origination where each part helps create the other. Humans form in a very similar way, and what I will talk about are 3 episodes of codependent origination. One from the early part of development, fertilization, where 2 cells interact to form the zygote, the fertilized egg. The second will be organ formation, where 2 groups of cells interact together, in this case, to form the eye. And the third, from the last part of embryonic development, involves bodily integration. I'll be looking at the capillaries that are in our guts that bring the food from the stomach to the rest of the body. So first, I want to talk about fertilization. Fertilization occurs by 2 cells that are on the verge of death. Both the sperm and the egg are about to die if they do not meet and cooperate with each other. Now, it's often thought of that fertilization is a race of the sperm to meet the egg, and that there's a competition between the sperm. In most mammals, this is not the case. Quite the opposite, that there are interactions going on that allow the sperm and the egg to get together to form this new thing, the fertilized egg. First, you have to realize that the sperm, when it's ejaculated from the body, is not capable of fertilizing an egg. The ejaculated sperm is immature. How does it get matured? It gets matured by the female reproductive tract. Cells in the female, cells in the woman, bind to the sperm. They actually embrace the sperm head, as you could see on the photograph, and they hold the sperm there. And while they hold the sperm there, they change the membrane of the sperm. They change the cell such that the cell gets the capacity to fertilize the egg. So the first sperm to reach the egg can't bind to it. It can't fertilize it because the first sperm that reach the egg get there very quickly and have not been matured by the female reproductive tract. So the sperm completes its development with the help of the woman's cells. Now, once that sperm has matured, it can receive signals from the egg. The egg tells the sperm where it is. The egg tells the sperm to swim faster. And the egg tells the sperm to release proteins that will allow it to connect to the egg. So the sperm, when it's ejaculated, can't receive these signals. Now the cell, the egg cell, is sending out these chemicals which tell the sperm where to go and how to get there. Now, here we have a system where the sperm is activated by the egg. Once the sperm gets to the egg, the sperm and egg fuse their cells together. It's not a violent penetration of the egg. It's not a drilling through the egg. It's not a boring through the egg. Actually, the sperm and egg come together and melt so that the sperm nucleus with its genetic material is now inside the egg with its genetic material. And the sperm now activates the egg. The egg was activated by the sperm. Now the sperm reciprocates and activates the egg because the egg is also an immature cell. Okay. So the sperm gets activated by the egg. Now the sperm activates the egg, and what the sperm tells the egg to do is to mature, become a fully developed egg cell. It completes its divisions, and so now you have the sperm nucleus inside an egg nucleus. They get together to start development. So there is a reciprocal maturation, a reciprocal induction of the sperm and the egg. The woman's body causes the immature sperm to become the mature sperm. The sperm causes the immature egg to become the mature egg. Together, they become the zygote, the fertilized egg. So that's fertilization as an interaction between two cells, both of which are immature. I want to talk now about organ formation. The cells have divided and they're beginning to form organs. I'll use as an example the development of the eye. Now, the eye contains many parts, but I really want to look at only two. The lens, which is that transparent entity, that transparent group of cells that focuses light on the retina. The retina are those nerves that will sense light. They are some of the very few cells in the body that can sense light. So how do you make a lens and a retina? Well, you don't make them independently. What we find is that the lens makes the retina and the retina makes the lens. So there is, in early development, a bulge from what will be the brain. That part of the body which is going to be the brain bulges out, and a bulge from the brain touches what will be skin of the head. And when it touches the skin of the head, it tells those cells, you are not going to be skin cells. Stop your development towards skin. You are going to become lens cells. You are going to become transparent, and you are going to enter into the eye. And so those cells, getting instructions from the brain, Okay. So those cells that get instructions from the brain start becoming the lens. And as they become the lens, they tell the brain cells, you are not going to become brain. You are going to become retina. and they interact with each other many times, sending many chemical signals across so that one group of cells becomes the lens cells, the other group of cells becomes the retina cells. The retina and the brain do not form independently. They co-create each other. It's codependent origination. This is the rule in embryology. This is an example of some of those interactions where the lens tells the brain to become the retina, and the retina tells the skin to become the lens. So we have here what embryologists call reciprocal embryonic induction. Organs form by the mutual coming into being of their parts. So we have this reciprocal induction, this codependent origination in fertilization. We have it in organ formation. I'm now going to talk about a new area at the end of development, at the last stages of development, which is called developmental symbiosis. Now, symbiosis means that you have different organisms of different species living together. And what has recently been found is that we need other organisms to help us develop properly. Now, animals do not exist as independent entities. If you think of a cow, the cow eats grass, but the cow has a problem. There's no gene in the cow's genome that allows it to make an enzyme to digest cellulose in grass. Mammals don't have enzymes to digest grass. So it has a stomach which houses bacteria. The bacteria have the enzymes to digest grass. Similarly, coral. Coral lives together with a plant, an algal symbiont, in each of its major cells. And these cells, these plant cells, live inside animal cells. And they make the oxygen that the coral needs. They make the sugars that the coral needs. When these algae leave the cells, when it gets too warm, the coral dies. The termite that I show over there is a pest. It eats wooden houses. It eats trees. Only the termite cannot do this alone. The termite has bacteria and protists in its gut that allow it to digest wood. Now, what's really interesting, going back to fertilization as a induction, as interaction, and organ formation as an interaction, what we also see is that during development, there are interactions with other organisms. So the light organism of a squid, for instance, a squid shines light on the floor of the ocean. But the light organ of the squid is not made by the squid. It's made by the interaction of bacteria with the squid. The orchid, the seed of the orchid plant is so small, smaller than a mustard seed. It is so small that the orchid cannot germinate. The orchid cannot develop without a fungus entering it. So the beauty of the orchid depends on the seed's interaction with a fungus. Our bodies are full of bacteria. We get them from our mothers. As soon as we are born, our mother's bacteria become our bacteria. The bacteria are critical. They help form our lymphoid tissue, the immune tissue of the gut. And they help form, for instance here, the gut capillaries of a mouse. On the left, you'll see the intestinal blood vessels, those important blood vessels that bring food to the rest of the body. They're shown in green. And without bacteria, you have very little capillaries, very few capillaries. But if you give bacteria to the mice, the capillary networks form and they can be healthy mice. The bacteria are needed for normal mouse development. This is development where two different species are interacting. Bacteria can also change the behaviors of mice. If you have mice without bacteria, they do not socialize with other mice. Matter of fact, they'd rather stay in their cage and groom their hair. However, if you add the bacteria back to the mice, they regain exploratory behavior and they stop self-grooming. The title of this paper from 2014, Microbiota is Necessary for Social Development in the Mouse. There have been many papers which have confirmed this, that bacteria, maybe Sinbu, bacteria are needed for normal development of our behaviors and our bodies. I want to show you this slide. This slide was sent to me by a teacher at the ETSI program, Bill Bates. And Bill Bates sent this to me, and he said, "This is a picture you would love." And I'm looking at the picture, and it's obviously a picture of frog eggs at the edge of a pond. And I email back, "This is a very pleasant picture. Is there anything special about it? It's frog eggs in a pond." And he said, "Yes, the pond is an elephant footprint." Who would have thought that an elephant would have been needed to complete the life cycle of a frog? So the scientific, So the scientific study of the origin of the animal body exemplifies codependent origination and emptiness. The body forms by the codependent origination of its parts. It does so by cause and effect, and we've seen this in the sperm and the egg. We've seen this in the parts of the eye. We see this in the interactions between different organisms to form the body. It also is important in non-self. We are physically unable to separate ourselves from nature. We develop with other organisms. We have never been individuals. This is something that's, I think, is new, that we develop in associations with other organisms such that we are more like teams than we are individuals. And last, impermanence. If something is to exist, it must be changing. The body is like a waterfall. It is constantly changing its parts, and that's not a metaphor. That is what metabolism is. When we eat food and when we release our food, we are changing our parts. The only way that we can stay the same is by changing our parts. And that's really a big definition, a big characteristic of what life is about, the ability to stay constant by changing your parts. So there's codependent origination, non-self, and impermanence. You already knew that. I've told you nothing new. I feel, being so honored today, that I should mention my teachers. I was introduced to Buddhism by Randall Huntsberry, and I've had the good fortune of being taught by embryologists, Barbara Bijon, Donna Haraway, Robert Auerbach, who always thought about life as a continuing process of continuing interactions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. Wonderful.
While Na Wang is getting set up, because we got started a bit late, just so you know, we will go till 3:30 this afternoon. You can keep that. You can keep that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, Your Holiness. I'm deeply honored to be here in your presence. Today, I'm going to give a short presentation on concept of life and its origin from Buddhist science and modern science perspective. As Dr. Gilbert had fully covered most of the presentation that I have prepared, so as Dr. Gilbert mentioned, that I might not have many things to say, but I shall try my best. Let me begin with my outline. So I prepared to basically share on 3 different topics. What is life, and human origination on earth, and then lastly, I will briefly talk about the stages of embryonic development in Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist scripture. Your Holiness, with your permission, I would like to begin with a quote from your book, The Universe in Single Atom. I quote, "The question, what is life, regardless of how it may be framed, poses a challenge to any intellectual attempt to develop a coherent worldview." With this quote as the guiding principle, I want to express that my presentation, as I mentioned earlier, is not an attempt to come up with any unifying definition for life, nor I want to proclaim that there are any new ideas that were not discussed earlier. So, what is life? I will basically stick with Buddhist scripture, as particularly Abhidhammakosha text, the text that was composed by Arya Vasubandhu. So, according to Abhidhammakosha, life is a span which acts as the basis for heat and consciousness. Now, what is the nature of life? Here, I would like to describe life through 2 aspects of it. First, its nature. So, according to Abhidhammakosha, it's a phenomena which is impermanent, as Dr. Gilbert mentioned, and neither matter nor consciousness, but a non-concurrent, compounded thing, because it is not a matter, because it exists in a formless realm, as Your Holiness mentioned this morning, that we believe in 3 realms: form, formless, and desire realms. So in formless realms, life exists, but not as a matter. And it's not a consciousness, because then there won't be a life in a person who is in a deep coma or non-discriminative meditative state. That's what Abhidhammakosha text define life. However, I will just highlight, as Your Holiness mentioned this morning, Vajrayana school has different understanding of life, as their understanding of consciousness is more profound and subtle. So according to Vajrayana school, there exists form in formless realm too. Now, what is the function of life? Life, according to Abhidhamma Kosha, it acts as the basis for heat, consciousness, or both. So it acts as the basis for both in desire and form realm, but in formless realm, it acts as the basis for only consciousness. Now, I would love to share a little bit about what modern science how modern science defines life. This is primarily for the larger monastic audience. Modern science defines life by what it does, not by what it is. Hence, they come up with a number of characteristics that are essential for life. They are as follows: ability to reproduce, ability to respond to stimuli from its environment, take in nutrient and release waste, ability to maintain homeostasis, growth and development, and lastly, adaptation. However, it is not necessary that every living thing have all these characteristics. An example, a mule, for instance, is a living being but does not possess the first characteristic. Hence, as long as the thing has most of these characteristics, it can be considered as a living thing. The cell is the fundamental unit that has all of these characteristics. It is also considered the fundamental unit of all living things on this earth. This is a beautiful insight that I gained learning biology, because as Dr. Gilbert mentioned, that there are more microbes than our own cell on our body. So the example is that if we remove all the human cell from our body, still the structure of the body will remain because of the microbes that coexist with the human body. And here, I would like to compare a little bit between a modern science understanding of life and Buddhist science. So on the first row, I have the 5 things. I have a typo at the last row. First, it's human, and then plant and microbes found in Arctic glaciers, and viruses, and last is the clinically dead person or highly advanced practitioner who remain in a meditative state after clinically declared dead. So here I have on the first column, I have the characteristics including the 2 from Buddhist science. So it's easy for us to say that human beings possess all these characteristics. Plants, including sub-algae or fungi, are considered as a living organism by science, but Buddhists generally consider this as lacking consciousness and such not having life. But I came across Vinaya Sutra, where it mentioned that a type of plant or maybe algae has some sort of a life. I'm not quite sure whether I have correctly translated or understood the meaning of that. Then what about microbes in Arctic glaciers? This is quite easy for scientists, but for us as a Buddhist, because we don't have a clear definition for heat in our scripture, so we might not be able to, since they are in a desire realm, so we should accept them as their life as the one that support both heat and consciousness. But I'm not sure whether they can produce heat in extreme cold condition like Arctic glaciers. And then viruses. This is a big challenging question put to both modern science and Buddhist scholars, because viruses, they don't have the first characteristic mentioned in the modern science understanding. They can replicate, but they cannot reproduce. And then lastly, I have here clinically declared dead person, mostly those who are in advanced, those who are highly advanced meditators. What about their cell after they were declared dead after more than 20 days? Their body are still remain fresh, but there is no any sort of nutrients provided through the circulation of blood. So it's a big challenging question. But we believe that the person is still alive in Buddhist understanding. So and I think the main differences between the two traditions as far as understanding of life is concerned is that the requirement of consciousness as a necessary element for life. This has a huge ethical implication for Buddhists. I'm sure there will be lots of questions at the time of our discussion afterward. Now, as we have some understanding of life from both Buddhist science and modern science perspective, let's briefly discuss how the two traditions conceive its origin. First, let me start with the Buddhist understanding. This morning, Venerable Thapkela mentioned about multiverse and also that the collective karma acts as the cooperative condition for the formation of universe. So let me just briefly explain what, let me just try to briefly explain what collective karma is. Since Thapkela mentioned about multiverse, we believe in multiverse, and there are sentient beings in all those multiverse. In Buddhist philosophy, we believe there is no beginning. However, individual universe can come into existence within that multiverse. So the collective karma from sentient beings resulted in the formation of this universe. Let me briefly explain how two karmas that are causes of the universe and sentient beings in it. Universe is somewhat like a termite mound. Due to the collective actions of the termites, without any intention of building its skyscraper, it came into existence. Likewise, individual beings play their own role that collectively lead to existence, to the formation of this universe. Additionally, an individual's karma results in them being born in this universe with different features. A classical example of this in Buddhist texts is the different perception of a ball of liquid by three different beings. A more contemporary example would be the differences in perception by wavelength of a flower to human and honeybees. Each organism's personal karma is seen to be the origin of this difference in perception. Now, we know the causes of the formation of the universe and its sentient beings. The first being on this planet, according to Abhidhammakosha, are the beings that took rebirth on this planet from the Apsara Brahma world. They are said to have taken spontaneous birth. Endowed with fully formed attractive physique, they survive on what is known as inner contemplative nourishment. They remain in that state for a very long time and gradually started to rely on material food. And then they started to lose their perfect physique. And then the degeneration started. The concept of spontaneous birth conveniently sidelines some of very important questions, such as the origin of their body, the relation between the functions and the structure of their body, and so on. Once again, these are the questions that are forced upon us by the detailed descriptions of origin of life by the biologists. According to modern science, the universe is 13.82 billion years old. Our solar system, including the Earth, is 4.6 billion years old. The last universally common ancestor, or Luca, is 3.8 billion years old. And the oldest fossil record of Homo genius is recorded as 2.8 million old. But the first life on this earth, according to science, should have come from a molecule which has a property of self-replicating of different version of itself. Of course, it cannot be DNA because it's too advanced to be considered a precursor molecule for first life on this earth. In 1953, scientist Stanley Miller performed an experiment that may explain what occurred on a primary earth billions of years ago that led to life. However, later scientists found more complex compounds on meteoroids than what Miller initially discovered. According to some scientists, it is possible that the source of all living things on this earth could have come from outer space. Charles Darwin, a naturalist from England, has more coherent way of explaining evolution of life on this planet. His idea of natural selection is the key to understanding of evolution on Earth. His four postulates stated that population has variation, that variation is heritable, resources are limited, hence the trait that has best ability to adapt will remain and have more offspring. Here, I would like to share some of the insight that I was able to glean from studying evolutionary biology. Studying evolutionary biology gave me a clear understanding of evolution of the beings in this animal kingdom, not just Homo sapien, but also of other animals. The powerful example of connected nature of all sentient beings that Dr. Gilbert just mentioned about symbiotic relations, that notion and the common ancestor notion in evolutionary biology is this complement with Buddhist notion of all mother sentient beings. The challenges that I face learning evolutionary theory is the idea of randomness. If the idea of randomness, if I understood correct, if it is somewhat like a stochastism or something that occurred just by chance, then it contradicts with Buddhist understanding of cause and effect. And then role of altruism in evolutionary process is a little bit inconsistent with the Buddhist understanding of selfless action. Lastly, I will briefly talk about the embryonic development in Buddhist science. This is based on the entry into the Womb Sutra. The sutra states that there are three causes of conception and 3 defects that hinder the formation of the embryo. The 3 causes are suitable to be a mother with menstruation, intermediate being is around, parents are attracted to each other and then come into contact. And the 3 hindrances are defected mother's womb, defected seeds or gametes, defected karma. And Sutra also mentioned about 5 developmental stages that are stretched over a period of 38 weeks. It identifies different wind energies as primary stimulators for the growth of the embryo. The 5 stages in the wombs are the oval-shaped one, the lump-shaped one, the circular-shaped one, the solidified stage, formation of limb stage. So here I have an oval-shaped one. That means is a living being in the womb. I would like to conclude with some open questions. When does the consciousness enter the womb? How many consciousness can enter a zygote? How to explain multiple organisms after splitting a zygote into 4 parts? When did the consciousness of these other 3 enter the zygote? These are the questions that I want to leave on the table. So far, this sort of interaction between Buddhist science and modern science had overcome many barriers. There are still many left to be explored. It is our hope and request that Your Holiness will continue to live a long life so that we can, with your continued guidance, attempt to investigate this question that are still unanswered. Thank you, Your Holiness. Thank you.
You need this? So Joel, Dr. Zivit, could you, as our first respondent, tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're coming from, and then I think your thoughts might follow directly from the questions a little bit that Nawang Lao was just posing.
Thank you very much, Your Holiness. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm a physician. I work at Emory University. I want to also thank you very much because one thing that I want to point out is how much fun we're all having, and we really appreciate the chance to be together. The opportunity for scientists, the Western scientists and the monk scientists, to be together is something quite extraordinary. You normally don't get an opportunity to mix with other disciplines like this, and it's really been just so helpful and insightful. I'm just going to refer to my notes. I'm a physician, and I work in an intensive care unit. And on an average week, 2 of my patients die. One I can usually predict, and the other one I can't. And the question of life and death are of great interest to me. I think that the question of what is life is fundamentally a moral question. I say this because our conduct concerns a division between what is alive and what is not. And when the sperm and the egg come together, it is clear that at that moment, the 2-cell coupling is not a person. It has no responsibility associated with persons. We consider it alive, and we offer it some protection. This protection is not absolute, because it is housed within the uterus owned by the mother. As the sperm and the egg divide and leads to the zygote and the fetus, it begins to feel more like a person. I think that the question also is, how did physics and chemistry become biology? I think that life should be a high standard or a low standard. We're interested in the zygote not because of what it is, but because of what it will become. As a corollary, we also are drawn to life that used to be something, even though it has since degraded. In both cases, membership within the community of being alive comes with rights, chiefly the right to continue to be alive. This early life in the case of the zygote, or diminished life in the case of illness or advanced age, requires the benevolent protection of other living things. And how does biology help us resolve the question of what is alive and what is not? And I want to, I think of 3 things. The first thing is, under what circumstance can we exchange a life for a life? What does Buddhism say about something like abortion? What circumstances can we exchange a life for the possibility of the end of suffering? If suffering is necessary for enlightenment, when has suffering been sufficiently present and of a sufficient duration to offer no additional teaching? How is tukdam to be understood? If the body remains fresh, it is employing a mechanism that I don't fully understand, and I would welcome an opportunity to examine such a body. I think that I also consider the concept of ensoulment, which may here apply. The zygote becomes a fetus, and karma enters it and creates a person. And how can we know that the karma of that fetus would not be a short life, that in fact would end within the uterus? Those are my thoughts.
Your Holiness, do you have any responses, Dr. Gilbert, Nawang La, before we go to Kechak La? Any thoughts about what Dr. Zivit said? If you have thoughts now, that's fine. Anyone else that want to address Scott?
I could certainly address some of the.
I want to
Oh,
add something.
please.
Yes, yes.
The Tudum people. So, another sort of quite a strange thing is the person I know, one, he quite old, so before his death, his body become very, very weak. After death, he remained in Tudum. So during that period, his body becomes something sort of much more sort of rejuvenated. Not only because that, the suya, the search.
So this person, when before his death, he was he had a very frail body. But after clinical death, his body became more like almost like rejuvenated.
So we don't know how it happened. So then the scientists also now this is something new phenomena. Some my sort of friend, some scientists now who really want to investigate more. Say that person, the scientist, actually rigid Davidson. So he have some desire. It's a person, some practitioner, who have some sort of possibility, who might have sort of, because of the possibility, at the time, at death, remain fresh. So he want some sort of interview before death. He asked me that, and very difficult. Who will remain to them or not? Nobody knows. Then again, you see, in early period, some scientists really develop interest about that. So at that time, a person, you see, after death, remain fresh, no equipment. Then we have, the scientists, they put that equipment at Dharamsala occasionally. So when equipment there, nobody die. When person die, that happened, no equipment. Then eventually, permanently remain there, and some nurses trained how to use that. So then, the late Trizul Buche, this morning, I think we mentioned 17 days. And that time, there is some wire put on his head. So they know, and then communicate with some scientists in America. So there are some very quick, some sort of electric sort of movement in their dead brain. But still, both sides do not know how it happened. So we need, as yesterday I mentioned, you see, we need full cooperation to further investigation. Abortion. Abortion, of course, generally we must avoid. But under particular circumstances, either the mother may die if the child comes, nor the child really deform or something, and the family not very rich. So they're going to find very, very difficult to take care of that deformed child. And then the parent, particularly the mother, is a wish or decide should remove. In such circumstances, you see, there might be some exception. So we always see every action, we have to sort of consider pros and cons. The Shantandewa clearly mentioned that. In Korea, another. I don't know.
So regarding how to help the zygote so that it doesn't die immaturely, this one is he doesn't know.
So we, after sort of all these things, were because of formed where chasanya dribble chasani. 말해. 뭐야 풍부야 차상 두 살에 지라 먼저 치료를 하셔 미군 배치 지고 봐. 복수인데 제동 말로 이 가르쳐야 돼 미신다. 그거를 결지 아무도 그게 온다.
So someone mentioned that in our practice, we have practices for increasing our lifespan, but we usually do that.
Physical level, some exercise, some yogi practice, like that, and some meditation, some recitation, but that is the embryo
at the embryo level, the zygote and so forth.
That cannot do that. So only I think some holy person pray from outside. I doubt whether really effective or not. I don't.
I was wondering about at the end of life, now a person alive, and in anticipation of their death, they experience suffering. And so how much suffering should we allow, and should we intervene to reduce that suffering as that person dies?
Suffering, physical level.
Yes.
Sometimes it's too much suffering, too much pain, disturbed in their practice. Mental sort of suffering, that's the way of thinking. If the person trained, so or say a certain meditation or certain sort of analytical meditation, and also trained the dissolution of body elements. There are altogether 8 stages. So each stage there is certain initially physical sort of some indication, some signs, physical level, more deeper, no longer physical sort of signs, but then mentally certain sort of appearances. So that, for example, my own case, my daily practice, I think at least 5 times visualize death. So suppose to prepare that the actual death come, but I don't know how success. But suppose you see some of these, also the tantric sort of meditation, yoga, Thai Nanjo, So there is certain sort of training, certain way of training, how to maintain peace of mind. And then with peace of mind, certain meditation. And mainly, this morning I mentioned emptiness, meditate on emptiness. So at that level, I think meditate on emptiness is, if you can, much easier, because the mind become subtler. Through certain sort of practice, this mind become more subtler, more sharp. Usually, mind becoming more subtler, more dull. Through practice, through training, we can maintain or even increase sharpness of mind. So, as a result of training or experience, training, then that actual sort of experience combined, then you can meditate shunyata more deeper way. So then that is the guarantee, next life, you have sort of the freedom to choose where you born.
Thank you, Your Holiness. Nawang, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was just wondering.
저기 안됐디 왜세 said, 시외 스페셜 세 멤버다. 시외 왜세 쓰도록. 시외 왜세 쓰면도와 저장고 치 심부시래셔. 왜세 간 인 시외래셔. 비참도.
So I was just wondering, when I share the beginning of human in this planet, according to Abhidhammakosha, there it mentions that those early humans rely on inner contemplative nourishment. So that could be the one which sustained the body of the highly advanced meditators who declared that. So there could be a research project that I'm just wondering, maybe if we test the cell of those body, maybe we might find different types of nutrients that sustain the body than the conventionally known, mundane sort of a material nutrient. So for scientists, that may give them a new idea about nutrients, and for the Buddhists, this might help us, prove the existence of contemplative inner nourishment. So this is just I thought.
Scott?
I'd like to address some of the items that were in Nawang's excellent talk and Joel's commentary as well, in terms of what symbiosis may mean for evolution, for definition of life, and kind of moral values, as you wanted to know. I think that life is really to be found at the collaborative intersection of numerous lineages, and that such symbiotic relationships really have become the signature of life on Earth. Whether we're talking about the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that sustain the terrestrial environment, or the coral reefs that sustain the aquatic environment, what we're finding is mutual living together. And this, I think, is really interesting in evolutionary theory, because evolutionary theory, for the most part, has been based on competitive interactions rather than cooperative interactions. And what we're seeing now is the notion of becoming with the other being part of an evolutionary framework, which does include the competitive, the battle of each against all. But we also have this notion of becoming with the rest of the team. And so that we may even evolve as teams. This is a very, very important notion, very exciting notion that is kind of fighting its way, so to speak, into evolutionary biology. Lynn Margulis said that life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And so there's a whole other notion of evolutionary theory that maybe those who compete best are those who cooperate best. And so this is adding a whole new dimension to natural selection.
Good, Drepung.
First of all, I would like to offer my deep respect to Your Holiness, and I'm deeply honored and blessed in your presence as a part of the panelists for this conversation with the Western scientists as well as the Buddhist scholar here. And I'm really impressed by Dr. Gilbert's presentation, and also beautiful presentation, my friend Nawang, on the origin of life and how they define life from the two traditions, from scientific perspective and also from Buddhist perspective. And Dr. Gilbert has defined the origin of life, life, not life as a general, because there's a kind of different discipline of science. So today I would like to say a few words aiding from Buddhist perspective what my friend Ngong has said, and also aid something with ethical issues with the life, as Joel has pointed out with your questions. First, I would like to add a few words. It's mostly with the fundamentals difference between the Buddhist understanding of life and scientific understanding of life. From the Buddhist understanding of life has to do with the presence of what do you call the consciousness. The conscious will be discussed tomorrow with another group. But conscious is the primary characteristic of what life is defined in Buddhist perspective. And yesterday His Holiness made a very beautiful comments on whether these small, very minute and the bacteria, whether they got the consciousness or not. So this is very powerful thought, and we as Buddhist monks and also the scientists should always explore on the very beautiful example of this existing of this life for the bacteria and not. One thing is the capacity that we have, or any sentient beings, is capacity to think. And another one is just capacity to feel pleasure and pain. And His Holiness also make a very beautiful comments like the sense of self, whether this bacteria is God or not. So this is a beautiful thing. And also I would like to make a difference, different comments on Dr. Joel is say about the connected all sentient beings. So this has to do with the evolutions. In the evolution theories, it mentioned that we all are interconnected. We all evolve from the very simple, the atoms, and it's grow bigger and bigger. At the end, it becomes a huge, complex human being, or any sentient being, or any live plant, or anything else. So these are the how we are connected. So in the evolution theory, it call it the common ancestor. We all share the common ancestor, whether it's a small insect, whether it's a very big, chimpanzee or human, we all share the common ancestor. So as a similar idea in Buddhist, we also have the idea of, we are all connected to each other, and everybody, in the previous life or one or other, have been your parents in the past life or many, many years back. So there's some connection between the explanation of modern understanding of evolution as well as the Buddhist understanding of evolution. But from the Buddhist perspective, evolution in the sense, as now as explained in his slides, PowerPoint slides, so it's more like from the descendant of celestial being from the higher order, like, as we pointed out in this slide, like the higher realms. So those beings which exhausted the very, what do you say, the positive karma, so they descended on the, like lower realms. So this is how the diversity of life is, started on this planet, or what do you call this, our universe. So there's lots of similarity and commonality between Buddhist understanding of diversity of life on this planet, as well as from the scientific perspective of life. And another thing I would like to point out is, His Holiness always, always like make commands and also encourage and inspire everybody about the promotion of human values. So from this perspective, from the Buddhist perspective, we want to know that, and also from the scientific perspective, life is so precious, and why we hold so important life. And is there a difference between the quality of life in animals and human being? So why shouldn't we harm others? So these are the very important thing that we pay lots of attention on, not only for oneself, but for others. Not as a plants or other thing, but even small insect. So this is the notion that Buddhist idea of, importance of life and how we should care, and not just through the definitions, but in real life, how should we practice all these things. So this is my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Good job. Joe?
When I was here teaching, one of the things that was most impressive was the experience of watching the monks debate. It's quite a pedagogical experience. And so as an exercise, I posed a question. I said, would it be acceptable to kill a bad bacteria to save a good person? And what turned out to be debated was the opposite question. Is it acceptable to kill a bad man to save a good bacteria? And I think that my relationship with bacteria began to change really when I was here. And I think that medicine, even medical practice, is undergoing a change in our relationship with bacteria. In the typical present practice, a patient will come into the intensive care unit, and after a period of time, they may acquire an infection. And then we seek the advice of our infectious disease colleagues who might prescribe an antibiotic. And what may happen as a consequence of that exposure is that the patient gets sicker. They may develop, for example, a diarrheal illness that is a consequence of exposure to that antibiotic. What we now realize is that in that form of diarrhea, the best treatment, in fact, is a transplant of stool from a healthy individual. So we're actually
more bacteria,
which contains the common normal bacteria of a healthy person, to actually give that to the sick person as a treatment. So it's a dramatic example of working symbiotically with bacteria, and it's really I think a revolutionary idea in terms of treating certain sorts of infections.
Thanks, Joel. Can you pass that down to your left, Christoph? And then John.
네네. 안주 안다. 배전한 대중아. 룰을 심부 결의 시동 삼아래. 저 심부 결의 시동 써야지. 디 샘내 이나면은. 디 샘내 이비체 소자 있느니 음지도 디고 주고 star다 있네. 근데 이나디 당초 소사 라이프 사디 경을의 라이프 열봐. 그봐. 그걸 통마 게 되네야 가서 우리 거라 살 지다지 그걸 라이프도 가. 그봐. 다데 맞으스나 샘데 맨스로 다 라이프 샘데 인데메 다디 아더 백테리아 is a life 요체 다 샘데 인데메나 사디 그 제가 누버도 쉬우지래샤 그는 배나 사직하실 대응도가 가서 그래. 지 치마하고 소리던데. 그래 순디 폐지로야 된다리야. 배는 정부 치마하고 샤샤나. 그 폐지로야 된다. 디티리야 지금 심진들이 연배 거둘이야. 아니 그 누구디 심진 룰파 뿔파 자체. 이는 그 접주기야. 배는 신다 패션은 쿠마서 메도스도 완전 세우지. ben di ke sun di chabe alia ko sun ga de pulu sto in de hakbe de che chulu do di ko namshi iga marwa kor kor zeg ni be de chi da dan dum de shu di kunjo service solution da dum de shu re je ko ra jingmo bu so so le chi do di kor kor chi kore de so le rigu so le di pa pe ya chi ya 그렇지 지금 그렇지 가서 70주에서 그렇지. 이 샘데는 메시. 샘데 많이 있어 그러고. 다들 제가 누가 좋아다. 저는 님은도 샤샤나. 샤게 님은 샤를 그들이야 또 스카야로. 애네도 뭐 님은 컨디스집에 있고 너리기도. 그리고 제가 누가 좋아. 제가 누가라. 당 아주 다 가서 계시는데 샘데 인더 메사 때디 임지도 앞에 가우치기 주셔야 돼.
Want to translate a little bit?
수주가. Translators, a person who have the ability to translation, everybody shy.
Yes. So in the Buddhist scripture, there are mention of human bodies containing 80,000 different types of microbes. Now, it's not
In our body.
in our body, in human body. It's not clear whether these microbes are actually sentient beings or not, whether they're sentient or not. If these microbes turned out to be sentient, then the people who are in the profession of, people who are doctors, they would be engaging in a lot of negative deeds. But then, so this is a difficult question, whether these microbes have consciousness or not. But we may be able to describe some of these behaviors simply through their chemical compositions. Often we see, even within plants, different plants have different characteristics. Even though the plants, they don't have mind, they have developed various abilities to spread their seeds. There are seeds that could stick to a body of other animal, and then through that way the seeds got spread out. And then some flowers have these very light yellow pollens, which are carried away by wind, and the seed of that plant is distributed widely. So even though these plants, they don't have a mind or intention, they have developed these abilities or characteristics through some chemical function. We may say that these are all created by some creator. That is the easy answer. But it seems like the nature developed through some kind of design. These, if we look at these attributes, for example, if we look at the sunflower, the sunflower has this tendency to move itself and face the sun, and that must be described mainly through the chemical reaction or chemical property of the elements containing that sunflower. So deciding whether something has mind or consciousness is really a difficult question.
Thank you, Your Holiness. Christoph, you had a question, a comment.
Well, a comment on both of your comments. So in the
Sorry, sir, could you say who you are and how you're entering the conversation?
yeah, so I'm Christoph Koch. I'm a student and a scholar of consciousness. That's what I've done the last 30 years, thinking about and working on consciousness and its correlate in the body. And historically, because of Christianity, and certainly since René Descartes, the father of modern science, we've had this view that consciousness is associated strictly with humans, and that life is something separate. So we strictly separate the question of what is life, whether it's a plant or microbe or an animal, from consciousness. Now this has changed over the last 50 years, or the last 150 years since Charles Darwin, since we realized that there's this broad communality among all species, that many of our scientists or most biologists would agree that most, at least the animals that are similar to us, like mammals, like cats and dogs and monkeys and mice, that they also have sentience. That probably also other large animals like a squid or cephalopods have sentience. But in the West it's considered a very radical position to assume that bacteria are conscious. This is known in the West as panpsychism, the belief that psyche is everywhere, including, of course, in plants. And so a few people have that belief, and a few scientists study that, but it's not a very popular. For the most part, we assume that consciousness and life is strictly separate. And we distinguish them. Why? Because we can see, for example, in patients, like in a patient who's been in a very bad traffic accident, this sort of patient that Joel sees, when the patient clearly is alive, but there's no evidence, at least that we can ascertain from the outside, from the bedside, that there's any consciousness, that it feels like anything to be this person. And so many thousands of these people who are in coma or in a similar state called persistent vegetative state, we believe are alive. They breathe, sometimes their eyes are open, sometimes they move and they moan, but we think there isn't anybody home. It doesn't feel like anything. And so as a consequence also of this, since the late 60s, in most Western countries, death is defined not by cessation of life anymore, as it used to be, right? You stop breathing and your heart stops and then you're dead. Today, death, the end of life is defined in America and UK and Europe as the brain death. So if your brain is dead, we believe you're dead. That it doesn't feel like anything. If your brain is gone for a certain amount of time, then we believe there is nobody home anymore.
No? Do you have a response to that? No? Catch a response?
Yes, these are very beautiful questions. From the Buddhist perspective, as I mentioned before, the primary characteristic of life is whether the presence of consciousness or not. So once, if you think about the plants and all this, like trees, so they're growing and they have a special ability to, some plant have ability to move from one place to another. But we cannot confirm whether they go to consciousness or not, as well as microbe like amoeba, all these things, they move from one place to another. But these are the things we have to explore. So we too have the same problem.
John?
So I would
just remind us.
I'm John Durant. I spoke yesterday about the nature of science. I would just like to put in a good word for plants. It seems I'm associated with plants in this meeting. In fact, the biology teacher here kindly found me a piece of lichen from a tree down the road. I was very grateful. This is a very splendid example of a plant. But actually it's not quite strictly true. But anyway, I wanted to just refer to the very useful chart that you kindly put on the screen, which I think would allow quite a lot of progress in the discussion between scientific and Buddhist ideas of life. But one thing that slightly surprised me on the chart was that plants seemed to be coming off worse than microbes. So if you look, we have a question mark about whether plants take in nutrients and release waste, and whether they have the ability to maintain homeostasis, which means maintaining a constant internal state when the external world is changing. And I just want to say that, at least from a scientific point of view, plants have both those things. So plants do take in nutrients. The main nutrients for plants are actually water and carbon dioxide in the air. And sunlight too, as I'm reminded. It's very helpful sitting next to Christoph, who's going to keep me straight here. And the main waste, or one of the main waste products of plants, is the very oxygen that we breathe. So that's another example of mutual interdependence. You know, you could not have animal life as we know it without plants, but it's because the plant's metabolism is creating some of the conditions that support our life. So I would want to put a tick, I would want to put a tick in your box about metabolism for plants, and also homeostasis to a degree. So think about a cactus plant growing in very dry conditions, which on their own are far too dry to support life, because all life we know on Earth depends on a watery environment for cells. How does the cactus do it? It takes in water when it's around, and it holds it and keeps its internal environment suitable for life, while the desert outside is not. So I think plants have some characteristics that merit attention, and they can even react to their environments in many ways. We're learning today much more about what trees can do together in a forest. They can communicate with each other in indirect ways. I believe it's true that when one tree in a forest dies, its nutrients in the tree move from the dying tree to the neighbors. It's interesting. So plants have a lot to be said for them.
You want to respond to that, Noah?
Well, you know, I really appreciate Dr. Duran for your attention. Well, that was, although it's not intentionally done, but maybe there's a purpose that I leave the two parts question mark. I agree with you that, you know, according to science, plants do take in nutrients and release waste in the form of oxygen. So here I would just like to add a little bit, because being alive is also, I consider, very fortunate. Just being alive, because you are contributing. As a human being, we release or we breathe out carbon dioxide, which will be consumed by plants. And plants are the natural, according to science, the natural resource that the energy that we get come through plants. Initially, it comes from sun. It turns into the substance that we can utilize by plant, and then so eventually it's somewhat like, you know, we just breathing out, we are contributing something for greater humanity or greater sentient beings. So thank you for, you know, just pointing that out. Thank you.
Dr. Impey.
Yes, so I'm Chris Impey, it's astronomer, so I get to ask a naive question about biology. So for Scott or anyone else, I'd like to understand the beautiful example you give, and I'm aware of others, symbiosis and so on, this cooperative aspect of biological organisms that, you know, clearly allows them to thrive and flourish. I'm wondering how that has been codified in a modification of what would be classic or standard evolution theory, because there are some issues that seem to be there in terms of passing on genetic material and being subject to the environment. When you throw in a wild card of a completely different creature like algae, some other very different part of the tree of life, subject to quite different conditions with different genetic material, and then you end up with a package that clearly works, how do you get there? And why does it have adaptive advantage in a Darwinian classic sense? So as soon as you broaden to these symbiotic relationships, it seems like you need a new quasi-theoretical evolutionary framework to properly understand why that should happen at all, or how.
Scott?
Yeah, absolutely right. In that this is a very controversial, the notion that the symbiont host holobiont, as it's called, the host plus its persistent symbionts, is a unit of evolutionary selection, is something which is coming up in the literature and being challenged. Right now, this is where evolutionary theory, I think, is at the forefront. And what we know is that not only do the symbionts help make what we have called the individual, this composite, but also different alleles in the bacteria can cause changes in the holobiont.
Scott, maybe explain what alleles
Yeah,
are.
okay. Allele is a different form of the same gene. So a locus, a gene locus, is like a parking space, and the allele could be a different brand of car in that space. So you have different forms of the same gene. And there are cases in insects, which are very well studied, where whether or not the insect can thrive in heat depends not on its own genome, but the genome of the microbes that it has. Similarly, many organisms don't exist, as I mentioned, without these microbes. Let's see, what do these microbes allow? Why would one want to have microbes instead of incorporating this directly into one's own genome? The microbes probably allow plasticity, so that you have, it's another source of variation. For instance, again, in the aphids, there are aphids which better survive in the cold and aphids that better survive in the heat. Why? Because some aphids have different type of bacteria in them. We know that bacteria are responsible, for instance, in fish, for the stem cell division of the gut stem cells. We know that in fish also, the microbes are necessary for the multiplication of the insulin-secreting beta cells of the pancreas. These are not minor things. These are part of organisms' development. What we also find is that the symbionts have their own mechanism for transmission. You know, if you have these genes, you want them transmitted from one generation to the other. In insects, it's mostly that they are in the egg cell, that they actually are incorporated into the egg cell and are given to the next generation as part of the endowment of the egg. In mammals, we get them as soon as the amnion breaks. As soon as that amnion breaks, we get colonized by the microbes of the woman's reproductive tract and the distal part, the lower part of the digestive tube. What's fascinating is these microbes, which are now populating our gut and which are competing for spaces in the gut, are fed by mother's milk, okay? And mother's milk has two types of nutrients. One is for the newborn, and the other is for a certain group of bacteria that you want to be the first colonists. So we have evolved associations with these microbes which are very deep. And we've even evolved transmission mechanisms to propagate them from one generation to the other. So this right now is one of the big, it's one of the big questions in evolutionary theory. How do you make an evolutionary theory for teams of organisms evolving? Yeah.
So, Your Holiness, this might be some new, despite what Scott said, this might be some new ideas. Did you have some reflections or some questions?
Just my sort of curiosity. I think we have to sort of make distinction, consciousness and body. I think body, basically, I think similar combination of some chemical. So other planet, plant, and our body, the system more or less of the same. Now difference is consciousness or mind. So now question is, I think brain is the special sort of organ, much related with mind or consciousness, isn't it? So this body, I think, can develop a combination of different sort of chemical. I think we can develop, for example, some other sort of organs. Can you sort of develop artificial brain?
Joe, can you can you repeat the question?
Yeah, is it possible to develop an artificial brain? That's your question? I'm not sure it's even possible to develop a natural brain sometimes, but there are certainly things that can be replaced by the nervous system in a very basic way, but that to create an artificial brain is beyond, I think, anyone's understanding. We can replace other parts of the body with machines fairly effectively, but when it comes to the brain, it's an order of magnitude, sort of a problem.
What is the main factor we cannot develop artificial brain? Some other we can do. What is the main sort of reason?
Well, I think others would have a view on this. I would just say that, first of all, in order to replace something, we have to deeply understand it. And I think that we lack, perhaps, a deep enough understanding of what the brain does in all circumstances in order to replace it in a meaningful and robust sort of way.
Christoph?
Now then another question. We human beings, certain sort of size of brain and some unique things there. Then elephant, bigger elephant or whales or these also have brain. Then tiny sort of the insect. I think only question of size or complication. Otherwise, the tiny sort of insect also some brain, isn't it?
So ultimately, you're right. It's a question of complexity. So people have tried to build insect brains, and people have built little insect brains that can fly with reflexes, and they're still much simpler than real insects, but they're getting there. And in 10 or 20 years, we will have insect brains that are as complex, that have the same behavior as insects and that can fly. So and with brain, people have put computers inside brains. For example, if you have a patient that's paralyzed, that cannot move anymore, the patient can now think, can imagine moving, and then you have a robot hand that moves for him. Or people have replaced the eye by putting an artificial camera with artificial electrodes into the eye that takes a stream of photons and converts it into electrical pulses and sends it to the rest of the brain. So this is beginning to happen. This is called brain-machine interfaces. The big challenge is, as Joe pointed out, the vast complexity of the brain and the degree of control of machinery. But in principle, we're slowly doing that to help alleviate suffering of people who are paralyzed or otherwise are neurological impaired.
Then with certain sort of, or say the electro something. So the part of brain which which directly link with physical movement. That's what we call the sensorial consciousness. The other part of brain which only think, or these things, Can machine can help?
We believe so, but we have never shown it. So far, it's all what you would call either motor, like motor control, or sensory.
Yes, there's movement, physical movement. Huh?
Physical movement or taking sensory, converting sensory signals. Never cognitive, mental states. But we believe you can also create those. And we know, again, from neurosurgery, if I put an electrode during an operation inside particular parts of the brain, I can have memory. I can recall something from my past. Or I can have specific imagery, or I can find things funny. There's a famous case when you stimulate the girl here up front, she finds everything funny and she starts laughing. And you ask her, well, why is it funny? And she says, I don't know. You guys are just funny. Every time you stimulate this particular part of the brain.
With help of some machine, can you sharpening our mind?
Can you what?
Sharpening. Sharpen.
Right now, it's all done to replace with something that's gone, to restore lost function. Ultimately, we like to believe in the West, because we like to live forever, that we can also use these tools to improve our minds. But right now, for the next 10, 20, 30 years, it's going to be to restore function that you have lost due to an accident or something.
Well, hey, if you can give people a sense of humor, you're not doing too badly.
There is something referred to as cognitive enhancement, which may be what you're asking. There's a movement to try to address this question. Can we be made smarter? I think that if cognitive enhancement is something that makes us smarter, that may be not what we are trying to do anyway. I think we're trying to make ourselves wiser. But there is pharmacology, there is serious inquiry into creating medicine that would improve our speed and focus and thinking, and some of these things are already prescribed. So it's an open area of intense research.
Well,
So
I think...
Can you say the size, different size of brain. Otherwise, some small sort of brain, those very, very small insect, some kind of brain there. Say very small insect, some brain, not like human brain, but some brain there or not. So then if that is so, then can we make sort of demarcation? Any living thing which has brain, then that is a sentient being. Those sort of also living thing with life. Without that, then not a sentient being. Can you say that?
I personally believe that, but there's a very strong bias in the West that unless you have furry and you have eyes like us, you're not conscious. And so almost nobody I know, certainly none of my colleagues, believes that a fly is actually, that it feels like something to be a fly. That is, only very few people do that. We have, and I think ultimately it comes from our Christian culture, we've been conditioned to believe in human exceptionalism. We've been conditioned to believe that humans are above everybody else, and only we have the gift of conscious insight. And it's only biology and Charles Darwin over the last 150 years that has sort of widened the view that maybe we are not the only ones who have conscious. Maybe apes and monkeys and cats and dogs, etc., too have it. But that's something new. This movement in the West, that consciousness may be very widespread. That's not the majority of scientists.
Your Holiness, I think this is a natural progression to tomorrow's conversation, which is on neuroscience, consciousness. So I think it's good that it worked out that way. And I just wanted to thank today's panelists, Nawan La, Dr. Gilbert, Dr. Zivit, Getchuk La, and Your Holiness. Thank you very much.
Thank you.